On March 3, 1971, a Belgian anthropologist radioed a single word to her university before the transmission dissolved into static forever. Listen. 9 days later, when a Zairian army patrol finally reached her camp deep in the Ituri rainforest, they found tents still standing, equipment untouched, notebooks open mid-sentence, and not a single member of the expedition anywhere to be found. What happened to Dr. Helena Voss and her 6-person research team has never been officially explained. For 50 years, the case sat sealed in a university archive, filed under a name almost no one thought to search for. This is the story you were never meant to hear. Helena Voss was 34 years old in the winter of 1971, and she carried her work the way other people carried grief, constantly and close to the chest. Born in Antwerp to a family that had profited for 2 generations from the rubber trade in the Congo Free State, she had spent her adult life trying to settle a debt she never chose to owe. She was brilliant, meticulous, and almost pathologically skeptical of anything she couldn't measure, catalog, or photograph. Colleagues at the University of Leuven described her as a woman who trusted footnotes more than feelings, who annotated her own doubts in the margins of her field notes so that nothing, not even her fear, would go unrecorded. By 1971, the country her grandfather had once called a colony was newly renamed Zaire, and Mobutu Sese Seko's authenticity campaign was reshaping the nation's identity by decree, stripping European names from cities, rivers, and institutions almost overnight. It was, Voss believed, the last narrow window in which to properly document the oral histories of the Efe and Imbuti communities of the Ituri forest, before modernization, politics, and time erased them completely. Funding was scarce. Colleagues warned her the political climate made fieldwork reckless. She went anyway. She assembled a 6-person team, 2 graduate students eager to make their names in a discipline still reckoning with its colonial roots, a Belgian cartographer named Willem Sabé, a Zairian interpreter and guide called Baraka Mwenze, a nurse named Odile Renard, and a young British photographer, Thomas Ainsley, hungry for the kind of images that could launch a career. They were not amateurs. They were careful, funded, disciplined, and prepared for 6 weeks in dense terrain. And that is precisely why what happened to them still defies explanation. The expedition departed from Bunia on February 19, 1971, traveling first by truck along rutted colonial-era roads, then on foot into the deep canopy of the Ituri, one of the oldest and most impenetrable rainforests on Earth, a place where sunlight rarely touches the forest floor, and silence itself seems to have weight. Their stated goal was modest on paper, to reach a semi-nomadic Mbuti community rumored to still practice pre-contact rituals, and to record their music, language, and cosmology before it vanished into the accelerating churn of the modern nation-state. Baraka Mwenze, the guide, had made the journey twice before. But this time, local porters hired in the last village before the deep forest refused to go further than a landmark they called Kisiki Chakimya, the stump of silence. When Voss asked why, the porters would not elaborate, only repeating a phrase that her interpreter translated uneasily as, "The trees there do not answer." Voss noted the exchange in her journal with characteristic detachment. Local superstition regarding a specific grove, likely tied to a historical taboo or burial ground. Will document if time allows. She had no way of knowing that this single dismissive sentence would become the most studied line of her career, pored over decades later by researchers looking for the exact moment the expedition crossed a line no one had thought to draw on any map. The team pressed on alone, the porters turning back with visible relief, refusing even the extra pay Voss offered. For 2 days, the going was slow but unremarkable. Saba's surveying instruments recorded nothing unusual. Renard's medical log noted only routine complaints: insect bites, blisters, the low-grade fatigue of difficult terrain. Ainsley filled roll after roll of film with images of towering buttress roots and shafts of green light. It was, by every account left behind, an entirely ordinary expedition. Their last confirmed radio contact with Bunya came on February 27th. Routine, calm, nothing unusual. Voss reported they had made contact with a small booty hunting party and were being led toward a more permanent settlement 2 days deeper into the canopy. She sounded, the radio operator later testified under questioning, excited, the voice of a scholar on the verge of exactly the discovery she had built her career hoping to find. Then came the transmission of March 3rd. Garbled, brief, cut through with an interference pattern that the university's own engineers later admitted they could not identify or replicate in any subsequent test. A single word, repeated twice, in Voss's own voice, flattened by static into something almost mechanical, almost inhuman. Listen, listen. Nothing more was heard from the expedition again. When the agreed check-in of March 10th passed in silence, the university notified Zairian authorities, and a military patrol was dispatched under Lieutenant Auguste Kalonji, a career officer with extensive experience navigating the Ituri's interior. The search took 9 grueling days through terrain so dense that patrols advanced barely 3 kilometers a day, hacking through vegetation that seemed, according to Kalonji's own written report, to close back in behind them almost as fast as it was cleared, as though the forest itself resisted being crossed twice. On March 19th, they found the camp. It stood in a small clearing exactly where Voss's last coordinates placed it. 4 tents, a cook fire long since cold, and equipment cases still sealed and stacked with the same obsessive order Voss was known for. Nothing had been looted. Nothing had been disturbed by scavenging animals, despite 6 days of exposure in a forest teeming with wildlife. The photographer's camera sat mounted on its tripod, aimed at the tree line, a half-used roll of film still loaded inside, as if Ainsley had simply stepped away mid-shot and never returned to finish it. There were no bodies. There was no blood. There was no sign of struggle, no broken branches suggesting a chase, no drag marks, no scattered belongings. 6 adults, in the middle of dense wilderness, had apparently vanished from an intact and undisturbed campsite without leaving behind a single physical trace of what had taken them or where. What there was, instead, was silence. A silence so total that Kalonji's men reported an instinctive, overwhelming reluctance to speak above a whisper, even to one another, even in broad daylight with armed backup at their sides. Several later admitted, off the record and outside any official report, that birds and insects, omnipresent everywhere else in the Ituri, a constant chorus that soldiers described as the forest's own heartbeat, seemed entirely absent from the clearing, as if the forest had drawn an invisible boundary around the campsite and refused deliberately to cross it. Voss's journal was recovered from her tent, open to a blank page. The final written entry, dated 2 days before contact was lost, read simply, "They do not sing to be heard. They sing so that something else will stop listening. B says we are already too far in to turn back. I think, for the first time, I agree with him." B was Baraka Mwenze, the only member of the expedition whose name would resurface, decades later, in circumstances no one involved in the original search could have anticipated. The Zairian government's investigation, such as it was, concluded within 6 weeks, a startlingly fast resolution for a case with no bodies, no suspects, and no coherent explanation. The official finding, filed in April 1971, attributed the disappearance to misadventure in hostile terrain, citing the possibility of a river crossing gone wrong. an encounter with dangerous wildlife, or abduction by an unidentified armed group operating amid the region's post-independence political instability. The report made no mention of the missing bodies. It made no mention of the untouched, undisturbed camp. It made no mention of the strange final radio transmission, which the university quietly declined to release to the press, citing its poor audio quality and its potential to cause undue distress to the families. Imagine, for a moment, being one of those families, receiving a folded telegram, a modest sum of compensation, and a silence that would stretch on for the rest of your life, with no grave to visit and no answer to hold on to. Belgium, still navigating the raw wound of its colonial withdrawal and eager to avoid reopening old grievances with the newly renamed Zaire, had little appetite to press the matter publicly. The families were sent condolences and Voss's personal effects, minus the journal, which the university retained for academic preservation, and which would not be examined seriously again for nearly 50 years. Willem Saba's widow reportedly wrote to the university 7 times over the following decade, asking only for a copy of the final radio transcript. She was told each time that no such recording existed. It did. The Ituri closed over the story the way it closed over everything, completely and without a trace. But the truth, as it so often does, refused to stay buried forever. The case might have remained a forgotten footnote in colonial-era anthropology if not for Dr. Amara Lund, a Congolese-Swedish historian who, in 2019, began cataloging the University of Leuven's uncatalogued colonial-era field archives for a research grant on the ethics of extraction-era anthropology. She was not looking for a mystery. She found one anyway, in a sealed box marked only Voss Expedition Do Not Circulate. Inside was the journal, the unprocessed roll of film from the abandoned camera, and critically a second, smaller notebook that had never been catalogued at all, hidden inside a false bottom of Voss's field case, wrapped in oilcloth as though someone had wanted it to survive even if nothing else did. It was not written in Voss's hand. It was written, according to a name signed on the final page, by Baraka Mwenze. Lund had the film developed for the first time in nearly 50 years, uncertain whether 5 decades of tropical humidity had destroyed the emulsion entirely. Most frames were unremarkable. Expedition members smiling in the clearing, a portrait of the cook fire, a wide shot of the tree line at dusk, ordinary documentation of an ordinary day. But the final 3 frames, taken in immediate sequence, showed something else entirely. In the first, the tree line was empty. In the second, a shape indistinct, elongated, positioned exactly where nothing had stood a moment before occupied the frame's edge. In the third, the shape was gone, and the exposure itself was strangely overdeveloped, as though the film had been struck by a sudden and localized burst of light no photographer present had reported witnessing. Forensic imaging analysts consulted by Lund in 2021 could not identify a conventional cause for the anomaly. Their report noted, cautiously, that the distortion pattern was inconsistent with common film degradation and not readily explained by heat, moisture, or age damage alone. One analyst, speaking to Lund off the record, admitted the pattern more closely resembled something struck by an intense, brief electromagnetic pulse than anything caused by simple decay, and then declined to have his name attached to that observation in any published material. The second notebook changed everything Lund thought she understood about the case and raised a question that would haunt her for years afterward. Why had Baraka Mwenze's name never once appeared in any follow-up investigation when he alone seemed to have understood, in real time, exactly what the expedition was walking into? Mwenze had not simply been a hired guide. His family, the notebook revealed, held generational knowledge of the region the porters had refused to enter knowledge. His own grandfather had warned him never to repeat to outsiders, on pain of a debt he could not describe, in words that translated cleanly into French. The notebook, written partly in Swahili and partly in French, described a place the local oral tradition called the listening ground, a stretch of forest where, according to generations of hunters, sound itself behaved differently. Voices carried further than they should. Silence pressed harder than it should. And on certain nights, something in the deep canopy answered, not with words, but with a rhythm that hunters described as a heartbeat too large to belong to anything alive. Mwenzi's later entries grew increasingly fragmented, mirroring the deterioration Lund had already noted in Voss's own final journal pages, as though something about the closer they came to the site, the harder it became for either of them to hold a coherent thought on paper. One passage, dated the same day as the camp's last coordinated transmission, read, "Dr. Voss does not believe. She writes everything down to prove there is nothing to fear. But last night she stood at the edge of the clearing for 2 hours without moving, and when I asked what she heard, she said only, 'Everything. For the first time in my life, I can hear everything.' I do not think she meant it as a comfort." Picture that moment for a second. A rationalist scholar, a woman who had spent her entire adult life demanding proof before belief, standing motionless at the edge of an unlit forest for 2 full hours, unable to look away from something her own guide could not see or hear at all. Whatever changed in Helena Voss that night, it changed something in her permanently, and it happened 3 full days before anyone else on the expedition understood that anything was wrong. The final legible entry in Mwenzi's notebook, badly water-damaged and only partially reconstructed by Lund's team using infrared imaging techniques not available to the original 1,971 investigators, contained a single unfinished sentence. "If they find this camp and not us, tell them we did not run. We were asked to..." The page ends there. The rest of the notebook is blank. But the question that sentence leaves behind is the same one that has driven every serious researcher back to this case for 50 years. Asked to do what, exactly, and by whom, or by what? In 2022, cross-referencing Belgian immigration and Mission Society records as part of her broader research, Lund found something that made her stop working for 3 days straight, unable to bring herself to open the file again. A man matching Baraka Mwenze's birth year and province of origin had registered, under a slightly altered spelling of his name, at a Catholic mission hospital in Kisangani in 1974, 3 years after the entire expedition was declared officially permanently vanished. Hospital intake notes described the patient as severely malnourished, largely nonverbal, and reluctant to be touched by hospital staff, flinching violently at sudden sounds. He gave no coherent account of where he had been for 3 years. He carried no belongings, no identification, and no explanation. He was eventually released into the care of a rural parish and, according to fragmentary later records, painstakingly assembled by Lund, lived quietly in the region until his death in 2003, working for nearly 3 decades as a schoolteacher and refusing, by every local account she could gather, to ever again set foot in dense forest, not even the modest woodland bordering his own village. No record exists of him ever being formally connected to the Voss expedition by any government or academic body. No journalist ever interviewed him. No investigator ever thought to cross-reference a malnourished mission patient in Kisangani with a case file sealed shut 1,000 kilometers away. If he knew what had happened to the 6 colleagues who vanished alongside him, including, presumably, Helena Voss herself, the woman he had tried, by his own written account, to protect, he apparently chose, for nearly 30 years, to carry that knowledge entirely alone. Lund located a single surviving relative, a niece in Kisangani, who agreed to speak with her on condition of anonymity. She recalled her uncle waking from nightmares in which he repeated the same phrase, always in the same flat, exhausted tone, no matter how many times family members tried to comfort him. Tell them to stop asking it to listen. She had never known what it meant. Sitting across from Lund 50 years later, she still doesn't, and, by her own admission, she has stopped trying to find out, because every answer she has ever imagined frightens her more than the silence does. To date, no trace of Helena Voss, her cartographer, her nurse, her photographer, or her 2 graduate students has ever been found. No remains. No equipment beyond what was recovered in the original 1971 camp. No further radio contact, no witnessed sighting, no grave for any family to visit. 53 years and counting. The University of Leuven quietly reopened a formal review of the case in 2023 following Lund's findings, assembling a small panel of historians, forensic specialists, and communications engineers to re-examine the surviving evidence with modern tools unavailable to the original investigators. Though, as of this telling, no updated conclusions have been released to the public, and university officials have declined multiple requests for comment on the record. The Democratic Republic of Congo's own government has never formally revisited its 1,971 finding of misadventure, a classification that, on paper, still stands today as the only official explanation for 6 missing lives. Dr. Amara Lund still keeps a copy of the final photograph on her desk, the tree line at dusk, and at its edge, a shape that was not there a moment before and was gone a moment after. She has shown it to physicists, to forensic photography experts, to elders from the region who studied it in silence for a long time before handing it back without comment, offering no theory, no reassurance, and no willingness to discuss it further. She has not been back to the Ituri herself. She says she isn't afraid of the forest. She says, instead, that she has come to understand something Helena Voss seems to have understood too late, standing motionless at the edge of that clearing for 2 unexplained hours. That some places were never waiting to be studied. They were waiting to be heard. And once they are, the choice of what happens next may never have belonged to the person listening at all. The Ituri forest still stands, ancient and untouched, exactly as it did in 1971, one of the last truly unmapped interiors left on the planet. Somewhere within it, if Baraka Mwenze's notebook is to be believed, is a place where the trees do not answer, and 6 people who, 50 years ago, were finally asked to listen. What they heard, no one who remains has ever been able to say. And the forest, as it has for half a century now, keeps its own counsel patient, immense, and utterly silent.